before we dive in, if you've ever felt guilty for saying no, if you've ever shrunk yourself to keep the peace, if you've ever wondered why doing the right thing for yourself feels so wrong, this one is for you. And if content like this speaks to something deep in you, make sure you subscribe to Empire of the Mind. Hit that button, turn on the notifications, because we go to places most channels are afraid to go. Now, let's get into it. There is a moment, and perhaps you know it, when you say no for the first time. Not the one you learned as a child, reactive and frightened. Not the one that comes from exhaustion or spite, but a clear no, a quiet no. A no that rises from somewhere so deep inside you that it almost surprises you when it leaves your mouth. And afterward, you feel something strange, something you didn't expect. You feel guilty. Yes, that's normal. But underneath the guilt, if you stay with it long enough, you feel something else entirely. You feel real. Carl Jung spent his life trying to understand what it means to become real. He called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who the world decided you should be. And in all his years of clinical work, in all his writings and dreams and visions, one theme kept surfacing again and again. You cannot individuate without separation. You cannot become yourself without first learning where you end and where everything else begins. That is what a boundary is. Spiritually speaking, it is not a wall. It is not punishment. It is not selfishness, dressed up in therapy language. A boundary is the edge of your soul. Jung introduced us to a concept he called the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theater. The persona is the face we show the world, and it is necessary. We all need one. You cannot walk into a job interview, a family dinner, or a first date wearing your raw, unfiltered interior self. The persona is a social adaptation. It's how we function. But here is where it gets dangerous. Many of us stop knowing the difference between the mask and the face beneath it. We smile when we are hurting. We say yes when every cell in our body is screaming no. We make ourselves smaller, quieter, more agreeable, not because we want to, but because somewhere, very early on, we learned that our true self was inconvenient, too loud, too needy, too much, and so we buried it. Jung called this buried self the shadow, everything we've rejected, suppressed, or hidden about ourselves. Our anger, our desire, our need for solitude, our hunger for more than what we've been given. We don't make the shadow disappear by ignoring it. We just make it unconscious. And what is unconscious doesn't go away, it goes underground. It starts running the show from beneath the stage. This is why so many people who have never set a boundary find themselves inexplicably exhausted, inexplicably resentful, snapping at people they love, crying without knowing why. The shadow is trying to speak. And it is saying, this is not sustainable. This is not you. So what happens spiritually when you finally set a boundary? The first thing that happens is a confrontation with the shadow. When you say, I will not be treated that way, you are perhaps for the first time taking the side of your own buried self. You are reaching down into the shadow and pulling something up into the light. Your dignity, your anger, your right to exist on your own terms. This is not comfortable. Jung never promised comfort. He said, and I want you to really hear this, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Setting a boundary hurts, not because it's wrong, but because the part of you that suppressed the need for that boundary in the first place is still afraid. It remembers what it cost you to need things. It remembers the rejection, the punishment, the withdrawal of love. And now, here you are, needing something again, out loud, publicly. That takes enormous courage, because you are essentially telling your nervous system, which has been trained to equate need with danger, that you are going to override its alarm system. You are going to trust something deeper than fear. The second thing that happens when you set a boundary is an encounter with what Jung called the Anima and the Animus, the inner feminine and masculine principles that live inside each of us. The Anima, present in men, carries the qualities of receptivity, feeling, intuition, and emotional depth. The Animus, present in women, carries the qualities of assertiveness, directed will, and autonomous selfhood. When someone who has been endlessly accommodating, endlessly giving, endlessly available finally sets a boundary, they are activating the underdeveloped side of their psyche. The person who has lived entirely in soft receptivity discovers their animus, an inner voice of authority that says, "I am someone who matters." The person who has lived behind achievement and control discovers their anima, the permission to have emotional needs without shame. In both cases, the boundary is an act of integration. You are not becoming someone new. You are becoming more fully who you have always been but never allowed yourself to be. Now, let's talk about what happens to your relationships when you set a boundary. Because this is where people get frightened, and rightly so. Jung understood that we are not isolated psyches. We exist in what he called participation mystique, a kind of unconscious merger between people. We absorb each other's emotions. We carry each other's unlived lives. We play roles in each other's psychological dramas without ever agreeing to the part. When you have no boundaries, you are infinitely available for these projections. People place their needs on you, their anxiety, their expectations, their wounds, and you absorb them because you don't have a clear enough sense of where you stop and they begin. When you set a boundary, you break the spell, and this is experienced by some people as a kind of psychic violence. Not because you have done anything wrong, but because the unconscious merger has been severed. The person who was using your availability to avoid their loneliness now has to sit with their loneliness. The person who was relying on your yes to regulate their anxiety now has to face their own anxiety. This is why some people respond to your healthy boundary with fury, with guilt tripping, with accusations. They are not necessarily bad people. They are simply people whose unconscious felt entitled to your psychic real estate, and you have just quietly, firmly evicted them. Jung would say, that is their work to do, not yours. The third and most profound thing that happens spiritually when you set a boundary is an encounter with what Jung called the self, capital S. Not the ego, not the persona, not the shadow, the self, the totality of who you are, including everything conscious and everything that is still becoming conscious. Jung believed the self was the organizing center of the entire psyche. He sometimes spoke of it in almost sacred terms as the image of God within the human soul. And here is the claim I want to make, and I want to stand behind it fully. Every genuine boundary you set is an act of worship toward the self. When you say, "My time matters," you are honoring the self. When you say, "I will not shrink myself to make you comfortable," you are honoring the self. When you say, "I need rest, I need space, I need truth," you are not being selfish. You are being faithful to the deepest layer of yourself. Jung wrote that the goal of human life was not happiness, not success, not even love in the conventional sense. The goal was wholeness, the integration of all your parts. The courage to show up as a complete human being rather than a curated, acceptable fragment of one. You cannot be whole while you are endlessly available to everyone else's needs and completely unavailable to your own. Now, I want to speak directly to those of you who were raised in environments where your boundaries were consistently violated, where saying no was met with punishment, silence, or rage, where your needs were treated as burdens, where love was conditional on your compliance. If that is you, and I suspect it is many of you watching this, then Setting a boundary doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it can feel downright painful. It feels like dying. Because in your early world, it almost was. Jung worked extensively with what he understood as the wounded child archetype, the part of us frozen in a moment of early pain, still operating from survival logic long after the danger has passed. For this part of you, setting a boundary triggers every alarm. It whispers, if I need something, I will be abandoned. If I say no, I will be punished. If I take up space, I will not survive. And the spiritual work, the deep, difficult, sacred work, is learning to hold that child with compassion, while simultaneously refusing to let that child run your adult life. You can feel afraid and still set the boundary. You can feel guilty and still set the boundary. You can love someone deeply and still say, "This I will not allow." The fear and the boundary can coexist. In fact, they must. I want to close with something Jung wrote toward the end of his life, in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He described the long, painful, winding journey of his own individuation, the dreams, the losses, the breakdowns, the breakthroughs. And he said that the greatest problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown. I think about that every time someone tells me they're not ready to set a boundary. That they'll do it when they're healed enough, confident enough, when they've figured it all out. Jung is telling you that day may never come, but you can outgrow the wound anyway. You outgrow it every time you choose yourself without abandoning your conscience. Every time you say no from love rather than fear. Every time you allow your edges to exist, not as walls, but as definitions. Not as rejection, but as identity. Because here is what Jung's entire life's work was pointing toward. Your soul has a shape. It has a particular texture, a particular hunger, a particular way it moves through the world. And when you live without boundaries, that shape collapses under the weight of everyone else's expectations. You become formless. You become a mirror, reflecting only what others need to see. But when you set a boundary, when you say with full presence, "This is where I am, and this is where I am not," something remarkable happens. You become legible to yourself, to the people who are actually capable of loving you. And perhaps if you believe in such things, to something far greater than either of you, you stop being everything to everyone, and you begin perhaps for the very first time to be something to yourself. That is not selfishness. That is the beginning of a soul. If this moved something in you, if it cracked something open, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to Empire of the Mind and join a community that is done playing small, done performing, and ready to do the real inner work. Every video we make is designed to hand you a tool, a Jungian lens, a philosophical framework, a new way of seeing yourself, so that you can build an inner life powerful enough to change your outer one. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs it, and we'll see you in the next one. Because the empire we're building isn't out there. It starts in here.